Yes, good afternoon, everyone. From Makunika, Japan, my name is Sejiyama. I'm taking 40 minutes of your time to present. It's the last session of day one. I'm sure you're tired and it's going to be quite congested session. But compared to the session earlier today, it's kind of a little more relaxed. So I hope you can enjoy. Let me introduce myself briefly. Again, my name is Sejiyama from Makunika, Japan. At Makunika, usually I'm responsible for CSERT globally and offering the services for identifying, discovering the public server for the enterprises at the same time as researching the threat trend when I have time. At seminars, I speak a lot, but it's the second time around for me to speak at the analyst conference like this. I hope you be kind to me. And there is a download link for the presentation deck today. And there are some, busy slide with small letters. So please download if you don't have the printout, on your hand. And I'll show you the link later, as a part of the agenda. So please, download them. So first, the background of today's presentation. With the change in the trend of cyber threats, I had started to research. So what it means specifically is that conventionally, the attackers are mainly the APT group, infiltrating the enterprise via email, and in discretion, the attack is done. And many times the attacks are not surfaced. And even if it's noticed, the information would not be published. However, starting from around 2019, ransom actors started to very active and started to infiltrate through the public server externally. The encryption and the data elimination and the flashy activities started to arise. So it started to be more apparent, and the victim's information is now more disclosed. But there's also the exposures also. And based on the realization that there may be a change in the attack as such as we observe, and I would like to share what I have found. And here is 3 things I would like to share. First, the leak information by the ransom gang and the press release by the enterprises and the analyzing the other reports by the security vendors. And I would like to share with you the results. So the first is about the ransom incident occurrence. And this is the information of the global victims. This is the double extortion listed on the leak site. And last year, as of November, it was 6932, and as of yesterday, it was increased up to 7120 cases. And this is the victim of the Japanese organizations. And I had checked the public information, press release, and so forth and so on. And this is the calculation. And you see, as of the end of November last year, 245, and it's increased since then. And this is thoroughly investigated, and this is the number that's almost correct. However, there are some discrete victims and the damages. So I would say that in reality, there are incidents that is multiple times more. And I would like to start to comparing the trend of comparing the victims globally and Japanese organizations and analyzing the press releases. So the global versus the Japanese victims. So the monthly victims, the number of the incidents, the scales is quite different. Yellow is the global leak, and the red is the victims of the Japanese enterprises. And if you overlay them, it's a similar wave. So as the global victims or the damages increases or the decreases, the Japanese, the targets, accordingly. And recently you hear that Japan is targeted, and some presses say that, but it's more appropriate to say that Japan also is targeted. And this is the annual comparison. So as of the November of 19, by May, for the first time, the double extortion approach was invented. And today, virtually, it started from 2020, the big ransomware era. And globally, 20 to 21, the damages increased. And in 22, globally, it has increased slightly to 4.5, and Japan a little less than 10%. So it had hit the cap. Almost. And this is the leak incidents by the attackers. On the left, on the gray, the number of the leaks. And it has been declining. And from the 2020, half of the leaks of the incidents and it was reduced down to a quarter in 2020. So, many cases, the incident is published by the press releases, voluntarily from the enterprises. That's shown on the right. And, the victims are not only myself. It's nothing to be ashamed of. It's fully penetrated. So that's one of the reasons. And also, there is an obligation for the enterprises to notify to the stakeholders that they became a victim. And the 190 press releases released by the Japanese companies, let's take a look at it. In almost all the cases, there are some the dates of the attacks and the time also mostly. So we had calculated on the right. Where the people are not around in the office and the defense is weak on holidays, nighttime, and early morning. And that's shown on the right. And clearly, it's increasing. And so the ransom gangs are accumulating their success knowledges and experiences so that they will be able to improve their attacks. That is to attack on those, the less defended hours and days. So Monday through Wednesday, the incidents increasing, but analyzing by the year 20 to 21, the Tuesdays and Wednesdays, you have the peak. But when it comes to 2020, the attacks are more on weekends. So clearly it shows the change in the tactics. So this slide I would like to skip, but on the left, the days, from the attack to the leak, and on the right, the submission of the press releases by the company from the attacks being identified. So every year, both are getting faster. So this is the data of the incidents that's identified for the overseas operations. Until last year, 25% percentage of the incidents overseas, but it has declined down to 20% this year. And one of the factors is that many of the recent victims are SMBs. And so regardless of the size and the sales of the companies, the companies are being attacked. And up until last year, big game hunting, the large enterprises were targeted. But this year, those small enterprises and organizations without any overseas operations are being targeted. Maybe accidentally, but Q4 of 22, you see that very obviously. So this is the number of incidents by quarter, and the blue shows the medical institutions, and the green shows the non-enterprises like associations, unions, and the academia. And half of that last year in Q4 was the victims. And we would like to see how that trend continues going forward. And that's all for the leak information and the press analysis. And so now I would like to share with you the report published by the security vendors. So the different security vendors' public reports and of the incidents that they had addressed, the incident vectors being the external public asset, and that's the yellow. In the last couple years, the trend of the report issued is that in any organizations, the external public asset is designated as the vector, and it is about 40 to 80% of the incidents. And up until 2018, the vector was almost email, but the situation again has been changing profoundly. And the incident trigger being the external public server. So particularly, what is the product and what are the abused vulnerabilities? We had looked into it. In the last couple of years, there is a threat trend reports. And there are some mentioning about the vulnerability mentioned. And as much as possible, we had looked into it. And based on these 25 reports, as shown here, we had looked into what are the products. So on the left, you see the product name, and the yellow is the numbers used, numbers mentioned, and the report of the CVE. And Exchange Server 19, Citrix 14, Pulse Secure 14, Forti 13, and Big IP 10, and Log4j 9 times. So it's kind of rough, but these are the most targeted the products that's abused. And looking at my experiences, what on here, and it's more on a VPN when it's limited to Japan, but it's consistent to our experiences. And the same structure, second page on, so please refer to it later. For your information, this data, I don't mean to disrespect the vendors over here. It's just that unfortunately, the abused vulnerabilities were discovered, and it's the widely used global products, and the vulnerability still remains. So it's just a heads up. So now, part 2 of my presentation. Since 2019, the damages by the VPN and external public server vulnerability has been increasing, and we had been given the heads up. But in this part, 3 years since 2019, how does that situation changed? Using Shodan, we had looked into it, so let me share those results. First, RDP port TCP3389, the number of the hosts published in that. The externally published RDP, like VPN, it could be the infiltration vector. But since November of 19, the devices by the country is shown over here. In the most recent data globally, 4.33 million. Locally, 120,000 hosts were being published. And globally, compared to 19, the number of devices are declined by 22%, but locally it's increased by 26%. But fortunately, locally in Japan, it has been declining as a trend. And at one time, especially around COVID-19 pandemic, the public hosts were increasing. But at the peak of 140,000 in March of 2021, it has been declining slightly. And these numbers includes the servers and PCs privately owned. But when we analyze the credential information of RDP, at least more than 500 enterprises own these.
So what we tend to see with corporate PC is the telework PC. Since network information on telework PC includes information on personal ISPs and mobile SIMs, it is easy to identify them. We can find more than 3,000. In the worst case, it is possible to see a screenshot of the login screen of the PC, so you can see the photos and full names of 1,000 employees, and in one real estate company, more than 1,000 PCs with SIMs are open to the public. Incidentally, the case of the face photo, we thought it was a bad idea, so we identified the company name and contacted them, and they're now dealing with the problem. Next is an out-of-support research on Windows OS. Normally, search engines such as Shodan and Census cannot directly investigate the server's Windows version except in certain circumstances, but I do this based on the IIS version. What I mean is that if the web port is open and IIS is running on it, you can see the version like IIS 6 or IIS 7, but since the IIS version installed by default is also decided for each Windows version, you can use this and assume it's Windows Server 2003 if it's IIS 6 and 2008 if it is IIS 7. And if you count the number of IIS 6, 7, and 7.5, there are 1.3 million units in operation globally at the moment, and 14,000 units in Japan. The table on the right shows the countries in the order of the rate of decrease in number of units comparing November 2019 and 22. These are countries that are still continuing to use the EOL Windows OS. If you look at the countries, and I'm going to repeat the same line in the slides that follow, There are many Asian countries that come to the top: Malaysia, China, South Korea, Thailand, Singapore, Taiwan, and Indonesia. Although Japan made rapid improvements in 2022, is still not in a good position, ranked at 11th. And so, similarly, research on out-of-support CentOS is shown in this slide. If you see a banner that says Apache 223 CentOS, you can assume that it is CentOS 5 system with EOL in 2017. And if you see 2215, you can assume it is a CentOS. The total is calculated based on this. Global figure here is just under 380,000 units and 70,000 in Japan, which is the second highest number in the world, which is not good. I'd like to now talk about the speed at which vulnerabilities are dealt with. The fierce upsurge in awareness of the danger of vulnerabilities in external public servers, of which we've been warned repeatedly over the last few years, I personally see as one of the turning points. CVE 2019-11510 of Pulse Secure, of which the attack method was disclosed in August 2019. And only this slide is based on data published by Bad Packets, and the following 4 slides are graphs based on numbers I researched using Shoda. The left-hand side shows the speed at which patches are applied by region from a certain point in time, and the right-hand side shows the speed by country. To give you a brief idea of the trend, the Asian countries have been slower than Europe and US and the global average in dealing with the problem, while by countries, South Korea, Hong Kong, China, Taiwan, Spain, and Japan have not coped well, as in the net 2019 data shows. However, when comparing Asia with Europe and US, the difference in speed was not so great, with Europe and the US being a little faster, so please bear this in mind. This is a little bit old too. CVE 2020-0688 was the first major vulnerability in Exchange Server, which caused a stir in March 2020. It was around this time that the difference in response speed between Europe, the US, and Asia started to become noticeable. About 6 months after the patch was released, more than 50% of the vulnerabilities in Europe and US had been addressed, while in Asia only 30%. 9 out of 10 countries where the situation is not good are in Asia. Next, let's move the times a little closer to the recent past. And Atlassian confluence of vulnerability, which was announced in June 2022 and caused a rather stir. The gap between Asia and the West was even wider with this vulnerability, with the patch released in June, and 6 months later, in December, 80% of the vulnerability had been fixed in Europe and the US, while only 30% of the Asian region had been addressed, and Japan was second from worst after China. The next one is also recent, proxy not shell in Exchange Server. This vulnerability trend will be looked at from a different perspective in the next slide. And like I mentioned a while ago, CVE 2020-0688 and the more recent proxy not shell, both vulnerabilities in Exchange Server under similar conditions. I would like to compare the situation 3 years ago with that of today. Surprisingly, the speed has increased considerably in the Western world, and in 2020, it took about a year to apply patch to half of the public servers. In 2022, half of the public servers were patched in about 1 month. I think that various measures have been taken over the past 3 years, but it is clear that the time taken is considerably shortened, and the difference between Europe and the US and the rest of Asia. In 2020, there was a 13% difference in the coping rate, while compared at a certain point in time, but in 2022, the difference was 24%. I felt that Asia, including Japan, needs to do a little more. We'll skip a bit here, and we are still late responders. So the research methods of speed of dealing with vulnerability introduced in part 2 are not explained in detail. So if you are interested, if you look at this, and please feel free to contact me if you have any questions. And this is the last slide for part 2. So far, I have reported on the global situation of external public servers and the speed at which vulnerabilities are dealt with. I will also briefly tell you about the current situation, specifically for Japanese companies. In January 2022, Macnica researched servers of 50 companies selected at random from among approximately 2,000 companies listed on the first section of the TSE on the all-center basis to determine how many of these companies' servers are vulnerable. The conclusion is we found rather serious problem in about 90% of the companies, in which out-of-support OS in 38 companies out of 50, out-of-support software in 45 companies, and 15 companies had RDP made public. And I have been examining the management of external public servers in more than 100 companies. And in addition to those 50 companies, except for very small ventures, there was not a single large company that had no problem at all. There would always be servers that have been left unattended for a long period of time, or that ports such as RDP and SMB are made public, which is not good. The headquarters of the company is relatively well organized in Japan, but if you look at their overseas and affiliated companies, you will find a number of problematic servers, which is feature common to many Japanese companies. Well, since the need to understand and manage external public servers, the so-called attack surface management has been strongly emphasized in only the last few years, there is no way around it. But I think it is necessary to continue to educate and take countermeasures here. And lastly, I would like to move on to part 3. I will share our attempts to capture changes in attacker tactics using device search engines such as Shodan and Census. This is the part I wanted to share with you the most, so I would be very happy if you can put this into practice after listening to the contents. And the background on this research is that, to repeat, in response to the recent trend of external public servers being targeted and attackers unilaterally disclosing damage, we have, in a sense, taken their method and used it against them. In other words, if we investigate the external public servers of the affected companies that the attackers exposed, we may be able to see the trends in the devices and servers that were used as intrusion routes. I will share 3 case studies first and then go on to explain the investigation methods later on. The first case is about Pandora, the ransom actor. The group's activities ended with an attack on 7 companies in March 2022, including 3 Japanese companies. When we did OSINT on these companies, we found that VMware Horizon had been published in all of them. I wondered why, so I checked the other 4 companies and found that they also had Horizon servers, and although the percentage of these servers they were open to the public was small, they all had one thing in common. They were open to the public. In addition, just 3 months before the damage in December 2021, vulnerability in log4j was discovered and the Horizon servers were affected. I tweeted on my Twitter account in March since I thought this was a very suspicious situation. Since then, there had been a number of alerts about the log4 shell vulnerability exploits on Horizon servers, and in August, Trend Micro released an analysis report saying that Pandora was also using this technique and found out that I wasn't wrong. My tweet is just a guess, and so I will only come to life when we have an accurate analysis report from the vendor, but I think that I was able to realize relatively early on that attackers like to use this vulnerability. Next, Avosa Locker example. Unlike Pandora, the RAS model is used here, so the actual attacker is not a single group, but multiple execution units, affiliates, and initial access broker are also involved, and so I wondered if we would see much of a trend. However, in late June 2022, there was a company whose Exchange servers were exposed to the public for 8 consecutive years. Furthermore, Exchange server version information is visible from the outside, so when we investigated the vulnerabilities, all of the companies either had a proxy shell that the attackers liked, or they had updated to the latest server version shortly after the attack, so we think that Exchange server must have been an intrusion route. As a final example, I would like to present the case of Deadbolt ransomware. This has been around for a long time, but since January 2022, it's a ransomware group that has carried out multiple attack campaigns targeting QNMP and Osaster's NAS. I think it's caused considerable damage in Japan, mainly to individuals and small and medium-sized enterprises. Deadbolt ransomware attacks NAS that are open to the public on the internet and leaves this threat message on the NAS login page. This is why Shodan was able to continuously survey the number of affected NACs. Moreover, since the design was changed for each attack campaign and the ransom amount was slightly increased, the differences in the threat messages could be used as a key to investigate the number of affected NAS units for each attack campaign. That's a table on the left, and that was a bit disconcerting. That was in 1889 units were affected in the first campaign, 3,696 units in the second campaign in May. Big difference from the total number seen by Shodan, which was 327,000 units. I thought there must be something to this. So I did some digging and found out that the server response of the NAS acquired by Shodan changes before and after encryption, and that the firmware version was clearly visible before encryption, and so investigated the affected NAS and noticed that the NAS models and firmware versions of the attack NAS varied from one campaign to the next. And we then provided the information to QNAP, and so it found that it matched what they had guessed, and so the information was useful in alerting them. This alert was the basis of a fairly large domestic and international media coverage, so I felt that the OSINT-based research has its potential. And for reasons of time, I will stop here to share the case study. Incidentally, these cases are not the result of having spent several years doing this kind of research, but on the contrary, such trends appeared when I just happened to look into some cases when I felt like it. And there are not a few surveys in which no particular trend was found, but nowadays there are more cases where a trend becomes visible, so I feel that this survey has a lot of potential. However, I do think this kind of research in my spare time between work and private life, yet there are several thousand cases a year, and so I see the shortage in people conducting surveys, so I'd like to use the last few minutes of my time to share my survey methods and know-how with you, and I hope you will put them into practice.
The investigation is divided into these 4 steps. The first step is to check for leaks and then the affected companies and identify suspected intrusion locations and check for server outages and version upgrades. We would like to introduce a method that is as cost-effective and efficient as possible with minimum man-hours so that you can do the same. I'd like to explain how to do this efficiently, because even if I share the contents to a full-fledged method for external public server, it may cost hundreds of thousands or millions of dollars to purchase tools and intentions, and the possibility of putting it into practice is infinite law. The method we will introduce are not 100% accurate nor comprehensive. The second and the third step that I am going to introduce, not just investigation, but the incident response person in charge. And if it is an incident response involving overseas, it may be effective for looking for the signs. And also that if you are the CISA person, maybe this can be used for the external investigation as well. And I'd like to explain step by step. First of all, the leak information check of the attackers. You can look at the leak site directly, but there are dozens of leak sites online, and it will be very difficult to keep track of them when address changes. So even if you had a crawler, so you might want to use a dark tracer site to save labor. You can create an account for free, and the information on victim companies is collected. Therefore, I think this is a very helpful site. And I was going to introduce that site, but there is a possibility that the policy for creating a new free account has been changed. Maybe you can only create a 7-day trial license. In this case, there are similar services, and if it is completely free, then if you Google and search ransom watch, you'll be able to see other information with victimized cases. And if you have any insight that you recommend, please put them on Slack. Whatever services you use, be sure to first gather the name of the affected company and the domain name that they use for their website. Using the domain information, using device search engines, you'll be able to do the investigation. And I am going to talk about the Shodan methodology, but hope that you'll be able to implement. So I am going to write the Zoom I instances methodology as well. And we do the SSL search, S search is like this. In front of the domain that you want to search, SSL colon, so Macunica COJP colon, and you search the string, and also you can search with SSL Macunica with the top level, second level characters. This search will identify all servers that contain the string Macunica in the public server certificates at once and will allow you to very efficiently identify server that may be the attacker's intrusion route. For instance, the attackers abuse servers often, such as Exchange Server, Citrix, and Pulse Secure, as well as VMware servers. HTTPS are used for sure, and most common method of attack servers in the product login console, HTTPS is used mainly, and the domain used by enterprises are configured with high probability, which I am going to explain. In case of ZoomEye, you can also search like this, SSL Macunica, and the census requires a little more step in the case of Shodan and ZoomEye. Searching with SLS searches for string from the entire certificate information, but census is a bit more complicated. After performing the SSL colon search, we will identify the IP address range owned by the affected companies themselves. We use Shodan's facet analysis feature, which allows us to visualize how many servers are running on IP ranges owned by the companies that are affected by SSL Macunica search, how many servers are on AWS or Azure, and so on. If the company is of a certain size, the IP range owned by the company itself will also appear. The red frame in the search result is the name of the owner registered in FOOS. So copy and paste this into search using org colon to find servers running on the IP address range. This will also reveal servers and network devices that do not have SSL certificates. So please perform this search. Unfortunately, both facet analysis and org search are specific to Shodan and do not work well with census or ZoomEye. In the worst case, the SSL search is sufficient. So you can do without this in the worst case. In this page, you can also see what to do if the affirmation SSL colon search and org search do not come up with any result. But if the suspect server does not come up, then there are many cases where nothing comes up after all. And I think less than 10% of the cases something may come up after all this effort. And after the server has been identified in the previous step, here are the perspectives from which to check the search results. In the case of Shodan and ZoomEye, check the result by paying attention to HTTP title and favicon of the server that appear in the red box. Servers, the Exchange server, and Citrix, and the like can be identified by their titles and favicons with a high probability, since they are often used for intrusion. And the favicon and byproduct and titles structures are going to be elaborated later. Census has a powerful product identification function that tells you which and how many products are available without having to memorize the titles and favicon. By looking at software vendor and product sections of the search result, it is easy to see at a glance whether a company has an Exchange server or not. I will explain what you should do if you find something in this section. And as a summary, there are differences in trends among device search engines. Shodan and ZoomEye are easy to search for servers, but the identification of product names is quite weak, so it is necessary to make your own judgment based on the title and favicon. Since this is a bit cumbersome in identifying server, but it's easy to identify products. And as a side note, ZoomEye and Census have a lot of searchable slots even with a free account, so it's easy to do a lot of things with them. If you can find on sale for $5 a few times a year, please try to purchase it. After identifying servers, look at the result of the search and need to find the server that may be used for intrusion. As mentioned, The following 5 slides, including this one, summarizes the product education know-how. The target products are the 10 products introduced in Part 1 that have been particularly exploited by attackers. The contents are quite detailed, and please see them later, but they all have the same structure. For instance, for Exchange Server, the method of authentication by shoulder, zoom, eye, and senses, and in the remarks, the possibility of identifying organization and the version information identification are described. For instance, whether the certificate has the names of companies, for instance, in case of Exchange Server, this is a mail server, so the domain used by the company is almost always associated with the certificate. So if you find Exchange Server, you'll be able to identify easily which company is using Exchange Server. But FortiGate and SonicWall use a product self-signed certificate, and company domains are not configured in many cases. Then either the host name or IP address owner information or the pieces of information that you can identify. So the possibility of identifying organization will be greatly reduced, and also the version can be identified by OSINT without scanning. In other words, if it is possible to check for vulnerability, we have also included some know-how on what to look for in the HTML. Exchange Citrix, PowerSecure, Fortinet, FGovX, IT, MVM, Horizon Attraction, Conference, and also SonicWall. And so for managed engine, which has become controversial these days. And please make the use of it when you do the survey. I have 2 final slides. The first step, last step is to check the survey we found for upgrades and server shutdown if you have any to do so. I don't do this every time, but if a company is hit by ransom and Exchange Server or FortiGate, I know it is a suspicious place to be more certain right after the attack whether the version upgrade was done, and also to confirm whether the server was shut down. And all of the search engines have a history function that allows you to go back and look at the past history, so you can make the use of this function. If there's a sudden change in the status immediately after the timing of the attack, it means the server was at the point of intrusion and the company may have taken some action. And this is all I have to share about the investigation methods. Last but not least, we have seen an explosive increase in the number of serious incidents, including ransomware, in the past few years, especially after 2019. With external public servers as a point of entry, recently we have seen an increase of so-called precursor malware such as Emotet incidents triggered by email. But as mentioned in the part 2, the management situation on the defense side is still not sufficient and the number of incidents is still increasing. However, the management situation shows that over the few years to come, the countermeasure against the external server will continue to be an important action. And Asia, including Japan, still have the room for improvement. So if you attend this session, I hope that I will be of some help so that we will have less incidents, so that the society will become a better place. And I hope that I will be able to continue disseminating the information. I talked about the investigation method in the part 3. I hope that we'll be able to get more references so that we can improve the feasibility. And if you tried it and if it did not work, or if you find any cases, please contact my account. This concludes my session. Thank you very much for your attention for a long time. And this is a completion of day 1. Thank you very much.